Hi everybody, I haven't done an Asperger's vlog video in a couple weeks, so I decided to do one today. And the subject for this one is the pros and cons of not being diagnosed with high functioning autism or Asperger's syndrome until you're an adult. And I'm covering this, first of all, because I myself wasn't diagnosed with Asperger's until I was an adult. I was actually well into adulthood. I was around 30. And it's really pretty common for people my age or older to have been diagnosed in adulthood, if they're diagnosed at all, because when we were children, nobody really knew anything about high functioning autism and they weren't looking for it. So a lot of us went undiagnosed until adulthood. And I'm going to talk about the cons first, and then I'll talk about the pros. And this is obviously all from my point of view and experience, so this may not be true for everybody who, has Asperger's syndrome or was diagnosed later. But as far as the cons go, I think one of the biggest cons or negatives to not being diagnosed in childhood is that, first of all, you do realize after a while that there is a big difference between you and everyone else your age. You start to see that you are truly different, and not just different like a little bit, but like, just very different. And you don't understand why. You look around and you see that the other kids, um, they're maturing at a different kind of rate than you are, and their interests are completely opposite of yours, and you know that you like to be alone. You don't actually necessarily want a lot of friends or relationships, and a lot of those things. It would have been a lot easier in childhood if I had known what was going on and why I was different in some ways. And this comes into play even, as far as like when I went into adolescence. I was very much a late bloomer. I mean, I wasn't really interested in a lot of the things other girls my age were interested in. I never liked to wear makeup. I never liked to wear fancy clothes, or actually, I'm very picky about the clothes I wear, mostly because of sensory issues. So a lot of that I didn't understand. I thought everybody had the same sensory issues I had, but they just hid it better. And that made me feel bad about myself, because I felt like there was something wrong with me, that I couldn't just cope with all this like everybody else did. And I just didn't understand that everybody was not like that. They didn't have that same struggle that I had. And another con is, sometimes I would make social errors, or um, just because of my Asperger's, I would understand things differently, take things more literally than, they were meant or whatever, and not really understand what people were saying. And that caused me somewhat to get ridiculed or made fun of, or even sometimes to get in trouble for things I truly didn't understand why they were wrong or why I shouldn't do them, especially when I was really young. And, social issues, a lot of times I didn't even understand what I did to get in trouble. And I wasn't a kid that got into trouble a lot, but sometimes I did, and often I would be left wondering, what happened? What did I do? And I think if I had known that I had Asperger's syndrome, and my mom and my teachers had known, maybe they would have explained it to me, so that actually I would have understood it sooner and maybe corrected some of those things. And then another con is just kind of the fact that you didn't have any help for the things that you struggle with all throughout your childhood, because people didn't recognize it. And for children like me, especially, who I didn't really have any major behavioral issues, and I was considered gifted, and so I was put in the gifted classes and stuff like that, and I was just kind of considered, I think, like kind of nerdy and stuff like that. But the problem is I had real deficits that were not getting addressed because of the Asperger's syndrome. And because of that, I think those deficits became bigger problems than they necessarily needed to be, and they could have been corrected sooner. And there are some things I still struggle with today that I think I maybe could have improved on if I'd have started earlier. Because once you're an adult, your personality and the way you live your life are already so firm that it's hard to make those changes, and it's easier somewhat with early intervention. Now, as for the pros of not being diagnosed until I'm an adult, probably the biggest good thing I think about not being diagnosed as a child is, unfortunately, I see a lot of children who have been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome who are kind of, because they have the condition, they're treated almost like, they're expected to be a certain way. Like, a lot of times they don't even work with those kids on things that they could improve. And the kids kind of get this attitude of, well, I have Asperger's syndrome. I'm always going to be this way. There's no use working on it because I'm never going to get better. There's definitely this defeatist attitude that a lot of young people with Asperger's have. I've even known some with Asperger's syndrome who, are in their teenage years, and their entire plan for their life is to go on disability and, never work or do anything like that. And honestly, I think a lot of why they think that way is because they think that there's something messed up in them and that they can't do normal things. And that's not true. I mean, before we were diagnosed, all the people in my generation who grew up with Asperger's syndrome, we learned to deal with things, and we learned to do things even if they were hard for us because we had no other choice. And in some ways that was bad and it caused some issues, but on the other hand, it was a good thing sometimes because I think if we had known we had those problems, we may not have even tried in the first place. And we would have lost out on a lot of things. And for instance, like, I've worked pretty much all of my adult life in one capacity or another. And I enjoy it. I wouldn't want to give that up. I wouldn't want to give up the experiences I've gotten from it, or the people I've met, or the good memories I have. I've always felt really proud of myself when I achieve things, whether it's, working at an office or working in a restaurant or a store, or I've also, the last few years I've been working at home as a writer and an artist, and I also kind of like do a little bit of a toy selling business on the side for collectors. And all of those things, I mean, I'm glad I have them to do, because I think if I just sat around thinking that I couldn't do anything I want to do because I have Asperger's syndrome, well, that would be a very depressing way to live, and I'd never do anything. So, if anything, I want to stress to people who have grown up with Asperger's syndrome and who always knew they had it, don't let it hold you back. Don't let the diagnosis or anybody else tell you that you can't be what you want to be or you can't achieve what you want to achieve just because you have this condition. And I definitely understand there are a lot of problems that come along with Asperger's syndrome, and there are certainly some things that we may not succeed at. But even if you don't succeed, you still learn from things. There have been things I've been miserable at or failed at or whatever. I mean, one day I worked as a telemarketer, and like I quickly learned that was not for me, and the guy never called me back anyway, so I think he realized it wasn't really my kind of thing either. So if I hadn't tried it though, I never would have known. So you have to at least try things if you can, and not have this attitude of, well, I'm autistic so I can't do that, or I shouldn't try to do that. So never let anybody, including yourself, limit you to that extent. So that's probably the biggest problem I see as far as people who have been diagnosed. Another issue, I guess, kind of along the same lines, is unfortunately some parents of autistic children have gotten to the point where they make excuses for the children to the extent that the child isn't growing and learning. Like, I mean, it's one thing to, tell somebody if your child does something that is socially inappropriate. It's one thing to kind of explain to somebody, well, they have Asperger's and we're working on that. But it's another to kind of excuse it and never even try to work on it. You kind of just figure, well, they're autistic, they're always going to be that way, so there's no use even working on it or trying to, solve the problems. And that is just, it's a very defeatist way to think. And I think that's somewhat why the kids themselves get the attitude that, they can't do anything or be anything. Because if your parents or your teachers are making excuses for you and not asking you to work on things and get better, then you yourself are going to start to think that you can never get better at anything, or that you shouldn't even try. So I guess that's, in my mind, probably the biggest pros and cons. If you yourself were like me and weren't diagnosed until adulthood, I welcome you to share your thoughts and leave a comment telling me what you think the pros and cons were of not being diagnosed until later in life, or even if you were diagnosed as a child, feel free to comment and tell me if you think there are pros and cons to it. So I appreciate you all watching, and I hope you'll hit the thumbs up on this and subscribe if you haven't already. So thanks, and bye.